Hardliners would have been disappointed by the fact that Spain's address included its usual rhetoric. But pragmatists would have noticed a change. Spain has extended the hand of friendship, but always without prejudice. The Deputy Chief Minister pointed out to the UN that despite the fact that virtually half the world had been freed from colonial rule in the decades after the Second World War, thanks in part to the work of the UN Committee of 24, the number of territories on the UN list had not changed in the last 30 years. It's 3 decades dedicated to decolonisation.
The Special Committee was established in 1961. That is over half a century ago. Only 1 territory has been removed from the list in the last 30 years. At that rate, the work of the committee will last for 510 years. Mr. Chairman, something somewhere is not working.
José García told the committee that it had a duty to consider the ROC's decolonisation in the same way it had considered those territories that had gone before. But he said it was almost as if it didn't want to. It has, he said, not sent a visiting mission or said what changes are necessary in the ROC's constitution to secure removal from the list. According to Dr. García, the answer as to why there's been no movement lies in a huge contradiction.
Spain complains that Gibraltar is a colony, when its outdated attitude towards Gibraltar is precisely what has caused the UN decolonisation process to stall, and Gibraltar remains on the list.
José García told the UN that Gibraltar was in direct Brexit discussions with the different member states, including Spain, to ensure that people and citizens do not suffer as a result of the departure from the EU. He welcomed Spain's new positive approach on cooperation, reflected, he said, in the Spanish Premier's address before the General Assembly.
Well, the Spanish intervention obviously contained elements that we don't like in Gibraltar. I'm sure my intervention contained elements that they didn't like either. So they went back to the historical position of the War of Succession and all the rest of it, and they obviously conveniently omitted to mention certain facts like the cession in perpetuity under the Treaty of Utrecht and the right to self-determination under the Charter of the United Nations, which makes it international law. So obviously it was a one-sided intervention by the Spanish again this year. In a sense, perhaps it's more toned down from the days of Margallo and the interventions we used to hear when Mr. Margallo was Foreign Minister. This is a step down from there, but it still contained elements that we in Gibraltar obviously do not like.
At this session, however, Spain fell short of the commitment given by the Spanish Premier Pedro Sánchez, limiting itself to hoping the new relationship proved prosperous to the Campo area. No specific mention of Gibraltar here. In fact, a commitment to those living in the Campo that their rights will be defended by the Spanish government in all negotiations on Gibraltar. Although there was a reference to Brussels and to the consensus resolution in the address, the specific call for a renewal of bilateral talks was absent. Instead, a call for renewal of talks and cooperation for the benefit of citizens on both sides of the frontier, but with no mention of the makeup of this forum. The address equaled that of every year, but one would perhaps perceive a sheer veil over it. The Spanish ambassador said the colonial reality was even more unjustified coming from an ally and friend like the UK. The UK's behaviour on the subject, it said, had been at best erratic. But it added the problem was not just political. Having a colony in Spanish territory, he said, had negative effects on the Campo. The ROC's fiscal regime and the cheaper cost of tobacco has distorted the economy and contributed to the deterioration of public safety. Spain, he said, had no problem with Gibraltar's prosperity, but he saw great scope for improved relations. For its part, the Self-Determination for Gibraltar group also called on the committee to act on its responsibilities regarding the ROC and either recognise that it has already been decolonised or say what it should be doing. Delivering the address, the SDG's Dennis Matthews said Gibraltar now faces a prospect of Brexit because it is part of the British family. Nothing, he said, would weaken the Gibraltarians' resolve when it came to the right to determine their own future. It's almost night here in New York after a very long session. But the day isn't over for the Gibraltar delegation, which has rushed off to a reception of the Gibraltar American Council. The times, they are changing. Our next trip to the UN could well be post-Brexit. Christine Vasquez from the Big Apple for GBC.